Hi, welcome to Logic Basics. Today we're going to be talking about skepticism. This will probably be a three-part series on skepticism. This is one of my favorite topics. One of my favorite philosophers is Socrates. And Socrates is well known for arguing against the sophists. And the sophists were paid rhetoricians who were teaching people how to speak well in public because they couldn't argue using logic because we couldn't really know things. Now there's a number of reasons the sophists thought we couldn't know things. It goes back to their house, the way they formulated the house. At the bottom level, they started with what's called empiricism. Empiricism, we'll learn more about at the end of this discussion, is the position that says all of our knowledge, all that we could know, is through our senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. These philosophers that Socrates encountered and that Plato depicts in the dialogues also believe that everything is matter. All that exists is material. It has size and is not conscious. Now, when you have these two together, all that we could know is through our senses, and all that is there to know is material. And you add the piece that matter is always changing. It's not permanent. And I'm part of the material world too. I'm not permanent either. There's no soul or self that is permanent about me. And there's nothing permanent about the material world. Then you get the conclusion that nobody could really know. We can't know anything for sure. There's no permanent knower, and there's no permanent thing to know. And that's where skepticism comes in. And so the sophists were pragmatists. They wanted to get stuff done. They wanted to do politics, and they wanted to make money. And so they were developing their skills in public speaking to persuade people, not through logic, but through other means, maybe by emotional appeal. And they were doing this to get power. Now, Socrates was opposed to the sophists because he thought you could have knowledge. And so he argued against their empiricism. He argued against their materialism and proposed something else. Now, what he proposed may have been insufficient, and we'll look at that as we go along. But what we're going to take from this discussion about Socrates is what knowledge is and how we could know versus the sophists and those who say we can't know. Now, this is important for us because today those same views are very popular and are probably the dominant view in the university, that all that exists is the material world. Humans are part of the material world. There's no self or soul apart from our bodies. And how we know things is through our senses. And so sometimes when you hear people use the word reason, what they really mean is our senses. So we need to make a distinction between reason, the laws of thought, and sensations, which are coming through our senses, like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, but they're interpreted in light of our basic beliefs, that house. So let's talk about what skepticism is, and we will also talk about popular versions of skepticism. So here's an overview. We're going to define skepticism and how it comes out. We'll talk about popular versions of skepticism. And then as we go through the handout, we'll get to more serious sources of skepticism. And this is the kind that is rooted in our assumptions that are uncritically held. So remember, we want to use reason critically to test things for meaning. So we're going to do that in three parts. We're going to start with this discussion of skepticism. What is it? Now, I want you to think about whether you are currently in this position of skepticism, or maybe you have a skeptical stance, or maybe you're agnostic, or maybe you're a fideist, or maybe you're none of the above. So we want to do self-examination as we go through this. What do I think about it? All right, so let's begin with a definition of a skeptical stance. We'll just define it. A skeptical stance is an epistemic condition of desiring further evidence prior to commitment to either belief or disbelief in a position. A skeptical stance is akin to doubt. So this is probably something healthy for us to have. When you hear a claim, let's say perhaps on the news media, and you think it sounds fishy, a skeptical stance is where you go, oh, I think that's fishy. I need more evidence before I believe that or disbelieve that. Health claims. Yeah, I do a lot of research online about diet, and a lot of things I read seem fishy. So I take a skeptical stance until I have further evidence, and I go, I'm not sure that's proper nutrition until I read more about it. All right, so we need to be having a skeptical stance. Someone might say, I'm skeptical about that. That's healthy. We should have that. Someone makes a claim about ultimate reality. We should be skeptical. Sometimes students tell me, oh, I watched this video about Alan Watts or something. I'm like, I'm a little bit skeptical about what he's saying. So let's have that healthy skeptical stance, but philosophical skepticism is a different thing altogether. So philosophical skepticism is the epistemic position. Notice this is a position, a stance you're taking rather than a condition of kind of like, I'm not sure, I doubt. Now we're taking a position. So philosophical skepticism is the epistemic position that claims that knowledge is not possible, that nothing is clear to reason. So remember our discussion last time about some things are clear. Skepticism says nothing is clear to reason. This position, consistently held, leads to nihilism or nihilism. Nothing is meaningful. Everything is meaningless. And ultimately, this leads to intellectual despair. No, despair is a kind of hopelessness. So skepticism leads to hopelessness about the possibility of knowing. Now, I often say skepticism is the position that nobody could really know for sure. Okay? This is very, very popular. It's the dominant position in our day, just like it was in Socrates' day. And so I've made it sort of my goal in life to overcome skepticism wherever I see it. And my desire is for you to think critically about it as well. Don't just assume nobody could really know for sure. Why would we believe that? Let's be skeptical about that statement. Nobody could really know for sure. Take a skeptical stance, do some research, and see if that's true. Okay? First say, what does that mean? Are you saying nothing is clear to reason? But I just went through an argument that some things are clear to reason, so maybe something's wrong with skepticism. All right, I often have students who claim to be agnostic, and I say, okay, I don't really believe in agnostics, but I say you could be agnostic for the rest of the semester. Okay, so maybe you have 15 weeks to be agnostic, then you have to figure some things out. Here's why. Agnosticism means no knowledge. It's usually a personal version of skepticism. It's often related to skepticism. Agnostics claim to have no knowledge concerning metaphysics. For example, I don't know if God exists or not. I don't know what the good life is. The problem is, though, if one has no knowledge, how does one know how to choose and act? So if you recall our house, if you have no foundation, then you can't build a system of values and attitudes and how to make decisions. We do make decisions. We act every single day, and our actions assume we've made a choice. And our choices assume we value one thing over another. And our values assume we have a view of the good. And so if we have a view of the good, we have a view of what is real or eternal. It goes back to that house. And so agnosticism is saying, I don't know. And so I say I don't believe in agnostics because I see people who claim to be agnostics acting, doing things, making choices every single day. So maybe they are unaware of their beliefs, but they actually have beliefs. So our job is to become more conscious and consistent in what we believe. And hopefully this class will help you to become more conscious of what you believe. You could look at your actions and say, well, this is how I live my life. This is how I spend my time and my money and my energy. This tells me something about my view of the good. And my view of the good tells me something about what I think is a human. And my view of what is human makes me think about what is eternal. And maybe I don't think there's a God, or maybe I do think there's a God. So going back to those basic questions, our actions should point us in that direction. And so agnosticism, I would say, is a position for first or second year college students, but it's not a position for life. It will lead to muddled thinking and to poor decision making. So let me help you to see what the options are, what the logical options are in the area of metaphysics and ethics, and we'll see if we can figure out if there's any position we should commit to. Lastly, fideism is listed here. Now, fideism is like the religious version of skepticism. Fideism is the epistemic condition. Actually, it should be a position. It says condition here, but let's change that. Fideism is the epistemic position that claims that knowledge is not possible. It's not a temporary thing like skeptical stance. It's saying we can't really know. Knowledge is not possible, but one must believe without proof or understanding. This position, consistently held, also leads to nihilism and intellectual despair. All right, so it is the religious version of skepticism, and it goes something like this. Nobody could really know for sure. You just have to believe anyway. And what's happening is usually the fideist is seeing the implications of the meaninglessness of skepticism and saying, if there's going to be meaning, we need something to be eternal and we need God. So even if the skeptic has a point we really can't know, we should believe anyway to avoid that meaninglessness. But notice, this also leads to meaninglessness. Why? Because if we can't know whether God exists or not, and they're asking us to believe that God exists, what are we believing in? What is the content of our belief? Can we even know what that being is like? Is the word God like blod? What does it mean, right? So when we ask, what does it mean? We're looking for a definition. And if we can't define what God is and show that it's clear that God exists, then why should we believe in that kind of being? Okay? But on the other hand, if we could define what God is and we could show that it is clear that God exists, then why should we not believe? We should believe what's clear. All right, so that's our discussion on skeptical stance versus skepticism, giving some definitions. I want you to think critically about these things. You should be able to define the following at the end of this lecture. You should be able to define a skeptical stance. You should be able to define skepticism. You should be able to define agnosticism, and you should be able to define fideism. After you define them, you should start looking for examples of these out there in your daily experience, even in your own life. Am I a fideist? Am I a skeptic? Am I an agnostic? If so, why? Okay, so we're going to use reason to test our own assumptions as well, and to start noticing assumptions. This is critical thinking. All right, so we'll pause here. Our next discussion will be on popular skeptical claims. So popular skepticism, we'll call it person on the street or coffee house skepticism. It'll be really great and funny, I promise.